Hi YouTube, I'm Manny Johnson, and I am still continuing recording on the day of the drunk outlining and the last chapter, and I am, if anything, even more drunk. But we are going to continue with the secret garden. This chapter is called The Nest of the Missel Thrush. Chapter number is, who knows? Numbers are an illusion created by our sober minds. The Nest of the Missel Thrush. For 2 or 3 minutes he stood looking around him, while Mary watched him, and they began to walk about softly, even more slightly than Mary had walked the first time she had found herself inside the 4 walls. His eyes seemed to be taking in everything, the gray trees, the gray creepers climbing over them, and the hanging from their branches, and tangled on the walls and among the grass. The evergreen alcoves with the stone seats and the tall flower urns standing in them. "I never thought I'd see this place," he said at last in a whisper. "Do you know about it?" asked Mary. She had spoken aloud, and he made a sign to her. "We must talk low," he said, "or someone will hear us and wonder what's to do in here." "Oh, I forgot," said Mary, feeling frightened and putting her hand quickly against her mouth. "Do you know about the garden?" she asked again when she had recovered herself. Dickon nodded. "Martha told me there was one as no one had ever went inside," he answered. "Us used to wonder what it was like." He stopped and looked around at the very lovely gray tangle about him, and his round eyes looked queerly happy. "The nests be here come springtime," he said. "It'd be the safest nesting place in England. No one never comin' near and tangled in the trees and roses to build in. I wonder all the birds in the moor don't build here." Mistress Mary put her hand on his arm again without knowing it. "Will there be roses?" she whispered. "Can you tell? I thought perhaps they were all dead." "Oh, no, not them. Not at all," he answered, looking here. He stopped over to the nearest tree, an old one with gray lichen all over its bark, but upholding a curtain of tangled sprays and branches. He took a thick knife out of his pocket and opened one of his blades. "There's lots of dead wood as ought to be cut out," he said. There's a lot of old wood, but I made some new last year. This here's a new bit." And he touched a shoot which looked brownish green instead of hard, dry gray. Mary touched it herself in an eager, reverent way. "That one," she said. "Is that one quite alive? Quite?" Dickon curved his wide, smiling mouth. "It's as wick as you or me," he said, and Mary remembered what Martha had told her, that wick meant alive or lively. "I'm glad it's wick," she cried out in her whisper. "And I want them all to be wick. Let us go around the garden and count how many wick ones there are." She quite panted with eagerness, and Dickon was as eager as she was. They went from tree to tree, from bush to bush. Dickon carried his knife in his hand and showed her things which she thought wonderful. "They've run wild," he said, "but the strongest ones have thrived on it. The delicatest ones have died out. But the others has grown and growed and spread till they're wonder. See here." He pulled down a thick, gray, dry-looking branch. "A body might think that was dead wood, but I don't believe it is. Don't to the root. I'll cut it low down and see." He knelt with his knife, cut the lifeless-looking branch through, not far above the earth. "There," he said exultantly. "I told thee so. There's green in the wood yet. Look at it." Mary was down on her knees before he spoke, gazing with all her might. "When it looks a bit greenish and juicy like that, it's wick," he explained. "When the inside is dry and breaks easy like this here piece I cut off, it's done for. There's a big root here as all this live wood sprung out of, and if the old wood cut off and dug around, took care of, there'll be." Oh God, I'm too drunk to understand what this Yorkshire means. All right, let's try it a minute here. "When it looks a greenish and juicy like that, it's wick," he explained. When the inside is dry and breaks easy like this here piece I've cut off, it's done for. There's a big root here as all this live wood sprung out of, and if the old wood's cut off and it's dug round and took care of, there'll be—" He stopped and lifted his face to look up at the climbing and hanging sprays above him. "There'll be a fountain of roses here this summer." They went from bush to bush and from tree to tree. He was very strong and clever with his knife, and knew how to cut the dry dead wood away, and could tell when an unpromising bough or twig had still green life in it. In the course of life an hour, Mary thought she could tell too. When he cut through a lifeless-looking branch, he would cry joyfully under his breath when she caught sight of the last shade of moist green. The spade and hoe and fork were very useful. He showed her how to use the fork while he dug about roots with his spade and stirred the earth and let the air in. They were working industriously around one of the biggest standard roses when he caught sight of something which made him utter an exclamation of surprise. "Why," he cried, pointing into the grass a few feet away. "Why did that there?" It was one of Mary's own little clearings around the pale green points. "I did it," said Mary. "Why, I thought I didn't know nothing about gardening," he explained. "I don't," she answered. "But they were so little and the grass was so thick and strong that they looked as if there was no room to breathe, so I made a place for them. I don't even know what they are." Oh my God, too drunk. Too drunk. Can't even words. Just glass. Dickon went and knelt down by them, smiling his wide smile. "Thou was right," he said. "A gardener couldn't have told thee better. They'll grow now like Jack's beanstalk. The crocuses and snowdrops, and these here is narcissuses. Turn into another patch. And here's daffodillies. They will be a sight." He ran from one clearing to another. "There's done a lot of work for such a little wench," he said, looking her over. "I'm growing fatter," said Mary, "and I'm growing stronger. I used to always be tired, and when I dig I'm not tired at all. I like to smell the earth when it's turned up." "It's very good for thee," he said, nodding his head wisely. "There's not as nice as the smell of good clean earth, except the smell of growing things when the rain fallin' in on 'em." When the rain fallin' in on 'em. I get out on the moor a day when it's rainin', and lie under a bush and listen to the soft swish of drops on the heather, and I just sniff and sniff. My nose in fair quivers like a rabbit's mother says. Sounds like he's got a weird drug problem. "Do you never catch a cold?" inquired Mary, gazing at him. She had never seen a funny boy or such a nice one. "Not me," he said, grinning. "I never catch colds since I was born. I wasn't brought up nesh enough. I've chased about the moor in all weathers, same as rabbits does. Mother says I've sniffed out too much fresh air for 12 year to ever get a sniffing with a cold. I'm as tough as a white thorn knobstick." He was working all the time he was talking, and Mary was following him and helping him with her fork or the trowel. "There's a lot of work to do here," he said once, looking about quite exultantly. "Will you come again and help me do it?" Mary begged. "I'm sure I can help too. I can dig and pull up the weeds and do whatever you tell me. Oh, do come a dickin'." "I'll come here every day that wants me, rain or shine," he answered stoutly. "It's the best fun I ever had in my life, shutting here or waking up in a garden." "If you will come," said Mary, "if you will help me to make it alive, I don't know what I'll do." She ended up helplessly. "What could you do for a boy like that?" "I'll tell thee what I'll do," said Dickon with his happy grin. "They'll get fat and they'll get as hungry as young fox, and they'll learn how to talk to the robin same as I do. And I'll have a lot of fun." He began to walk about, looking up in the trees and at the walls and the bushes with a thoughtful expression. "I wouldn't want to make it look like a gardener's garden, all clipped and spick and span, would you?" he said. "It's nicer like this, with things running wild and swinging and catching hold of each other. Except for all the parts where they're not wild." "Don't let us make it tidy," said Mary anxiously. "It wouldn't seem like a garden if it was tidy." "It's a secret garden, sure enough," he said. but it seems like someone besides the robin must have been in it since it was shut up 10 years ago. But the door was locked and the key was buried, said Mary. No one could get in it. That's true, he answered. It's a queer place. Seems to me if there was a bit of pruning done here and there later than 10 years ago. But how could it have been done, said Mary. He was examining a branch of a standard rose and he shook his head. Aye, how could it, he murmured, with the door locked and the key buried. How does he know that? How does he know that? Mistress Mary always felt that however many years she lived, she could never forget that first morning when her garden began to grow. Of course, it did seem to begin to grow for her that morning. When Dickon began to clear places to plant seed, she remembered where Basil had sung at her when he wanted to tease her. Are there any flowers that look like bells? She inquired. Lilies of the valley does, he answered, digging away with a trowel. There's the Canterbury bells and campanulas. There's the Canterbury bells and campanulas. Let's plant some, said Mary. There's lilies of the valley here already. I saw 'em. They'll have growed too close and we'll have to separate 'em, but there's plenty. The other ones takes 2 years to bloom from seed, but I can bring 'em some bits of plants from our cottage garden. Why doesn't the want them? Mary told him about Basil and his brothers and sisters in India and how she had hated them and their calling her Mistress Mary quite contrary. They used to dance around and sing at me. They sang, Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does thy garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and marigolds all in a row. And I just remembered it and made me wonder if there were really flowers like silver bells. She frowned a little and gave her trowel a quite spiteful dig into the earth. I wasn't quite as contrary as they were, but Dickon laughed. He said, as he crumbled the rich black soil. She saw he was sniffing up the scent of it. There doesn't seem to be no need for no one to be contrary when there's flowering and such like, and such lots of friendly wild things running about making homes for themselves or building nests and singing and whistling and does there. Oh, if only he saw 2020. There is plenty of reason to be contrary. Mary, kneeling by him, holding the seeds, looking at him and stopped frowning. Dickon, she said, you are as nice as Martha said you were. I like you and you make the 5th person. I never thought I should like 5 people. Dickon sat up on his heels as Martha did when she was polishing the grate. He did look funny and delightful, Mary thought, with his round blue eyes and red cheeks and happy-looking turned-up nose. Only 5 folks as there's likes, he said. Who's the other 4? Your mother and Martha, Mary checked them off on her fingers, and the robin, and Ben Weatherstaff. Dickon laughed so that he was obliged to stifle the sound by putting his arms over his mouth. You know the things I'm a queer lad, he said, but I think thou art the queerest little lass I ever saw. Then Mary did a strange thing. She leaned forward and asked him a question she had never dreamed of asking anyone before. And she tried to ask it in Yorkshire because that was his language, and in India a native was always pleased if he knew his speech. Dost thou like me? She said. Eh? He answered heartily. That I does. I like thee wonderful, and so does the robin, I do believe. That's 2 then, said Mary. That's 2 for me. And then they began to work harder than ever and more joyful, and Mary was startled and sorry when she heard the big clock in the courtyard strike the hour of her midday dinner. I shall have to go, she said mournfully, and you'll have to go too, won't you? Dickon grinned. My dinner is easy to carry about me, he said. Mother always lets me put a bit of something in my pocket. He picked up his coat from the grass and brought out a pocket or a lumpy little bundle tied up in a quite clean, coarse, blue and white handkerchief. It held 2 thick pieces of bread with a slice of something laid between them. It's often not but bread, he said, but I've got a fine slice of fat bacon with it today. Mary thought it looked a queer dinner, but he seemed ready to enjoy it. "Run on and get thy victuals," he said. "I'll be done with mine first. I'll get some more work done before I start back home." He sat down with his back against the tree. "I'll call the robin up," he said, "and give him the rind of the bacon to peck on. They likes a bit of fat, wonderful." Mary could scarcely bear to leave him. Suddenly it seemed as if he might be a sort of wood fairy who might be gone when she came back into the garden again. He seemed too good to be true. She went slowly halfway to the door in the hall when she stopped and went back. "Whatever happens, you never tell," she said. His poppy-colored cheeks were distended with his first bite of bread and bacon, but he managed to smile encouragingly. If thou was a missel thrush and showed me where thy nest was, that doesn't think I'd tell anyone?" "Not me," he said. "Thou art as safe as a missel thrush." And she was quite sure he was. All right. I am too drunk to analyze this scene, but hopefully I'll get back to it. And that happens. See you next week.